All right, so whether you were aware of what annotative objects or dimensions or text or anything else, whether you were aware of what it was about or not, you've probably come across a situation like this. You've seen this down at the bottom here, this little box that says annotation scale. By default, it's usually set to 1 to 1. When you fire up AutoCAD and you've never messed with it before, it's usually at 1 to 1, which is really not a good place for it to be. Okay? And if it's at 1 to 1 and you ignored it and weren't managing it at all, you probably went to work with something like this, and you tried to create a non-continuous line. Okay, you needed a line to represent something overhead or a property line or some other annotation element. And you set it up perfectly in your model space, and you click on it, and in the properties you've got the right line type scale. It looks correct. And then what happens? You go into your paper space. No, actually, let's do this again. So let's say, I got to regenerate this here. Okay, so let's say it looks like that, and you want to set it up. It doesn't look right. You wonder to yourself, why is it so small? So you click on it and you increase the line type scale. You crank it up to say 100, and that's what I wanted to show. So it has to be even larger than that, and you just keep cranking away at this number until it looks correct. And you say to yourself, all right, well, that's about right. So now you've got that line type scale up to a really large number. I'm going to go even bigger than that. Okay, that's what I want. So my callout box now finally looks correct. And then what happens is I switch over to paper space, and I go to print, and I look at this and I say, well, that's not what I set up in model space. Anybody been in that situation? Struggled with the line types? Okay, so this is where you've had some exposure to annotative objects without necessarily even knowing it. By default, AutoCAD makes all of these non-continuous line types, and in fact all line types actually, they're annotative. So what that means is that they adjust when the scale changes. So if you had been accustomed to working away with this set to 1 to 1, whenever you go to print, of course you're not going to print it 1 to 1, right? That would mean actually printing out a floor plan for a floor that was 30 feet wide. Okay? So you're not going to print that way. You're going to set up a scale. And when you switch the scale, AutoCAD automatically switches the line type scale. Okay? So what you need to do is you need to kind of train yourself to set this number in anticipation of whatever scale you're going to print at. Okay, that's how this works. So rather than leaving it 1 to 1, I'm going to actually set it at 1 to 100. Okay, notice how I had some text appear. Those are annotative text elements. We'll talk about that later. But once I've done that, now I'll see if I hit regenerate. At first it won't look any different, but if I regenerate the drawing, now suddenly it's changed again. So now I'm going to click it and I'm going to go back to that original number I had, which was 15. Okay, so now what happens is because this is set to 1 to 100, setting this up to look proper in this particular model space view means it's going to match what I want to print out here, because back in my paper space tab, this viewport is set to be 1 to 100. Okay, so we're going to kind of talk about some of the other annotative elements like dimension and text and all the rest, but that's just something that you can kind of relate to. And really what this does is it does away with the whole need to fuss around with, maybe you've used like PS, LT scale, and all these other settings to control and try to anticipate what your line types are going to look like. You don't need to fuss around with any of that stuff. All you need to do is just set this annotation scale at the bottom of the model space workplace here to the scale that you're going to print at. Okay? And if you say to yourself, well, what if I've got multiple scales that I'm going to print at? Well, whenever you work on a set of annotations or dimensions or text, just switch that number. And there's a little bit of a sort of foreshadowing into what we're going to be looking at next. Notice that when I had this set to 1 to 100, all my dimensions and a lot of my text it's showing right now. If I switch that to 1 to 50, a lot of it disappears. Okay? But more to the point, and this is kind of the crucial point of annotative objects, notice that in my paper space here, I've got one viewport that's 1 to 100, and I've got one viewport that's 1 to 50. But look what happens here. Notice that the dimensions on both are the same size. Okay? And it also applies to the text. Notice that the text is the same size. So where it says Office 03 here, 003, and Office 003, the text is displaying at the same size. Now you might look at that and say, well, I don't understand what the big deal is. Shouldn't it just do that? Well, it doesn't do it naturally. If I have a drawing that I'm looking at and it's 1 to 100, and then I want to go to a 1 to 50 scale, what am I doing? I'm zooming in, right? So if I zoom in on the drawing, what should happen to my text and some of my other symbols? They get larger, exactly. And on the drawing, that's going to look unprofessional if I've got all these different size texts and dimensions and everything else. Might not seem to you to be a big deal at this point, but if you want to have a job interview go sour, pull out a portfolio drawing with all those kinds of discrepancies, and whether you're reading it on the face of your interviewer or not, they won't be impressed. Okay? One of those fussy little things about drafting. So what we want to do is we want to create a convention in AutoCAD that allows that to happen automatically. You've perhaps experimented with what it's like to change this manually. You know, like you look at your viewport one next to the other and you realize, wow, everything's different. That doesn't look right. And then you go about maybe setting up another layer. And the other layer has dimensions for the different scale or whatever you may have done. So we want to avoid that. We want to set this up so that it just works automatically. Okay? So I'm going to jump back into model space. And the first part of this, I'll set my scale up in anticipation of what I want to print at, so 1 to 100. The first part of this is just to set up the dimension style. We're going to go to dimensions first. So hit D. Letter D is how you access the dimension style manager. And you probably are accustomed to working with the standard dimension style. So what we want to do now is we want to go to the annotative dimension style. And you can tell whether or not a style is annotative by this little icon right here. Any guesses as to what that little icon is? Yeah, so if somebody sliced a scale ruler, right, that's what that little profile is. It's not a little Toblerone bar there. It's a scale ruler, okay? So whenever you hover over an object that's annotative, you'll see that little icon appear. So it's just a little confirmation step. So make sure you're on annotative, set that as current. And let's click modify. And I want to show you some of the crucial settings in here. What happens when you use an annotative style is that you can measure things out or set up your all your settings can be in one-to-one units. And what I mean by that is, for example, on the text box here in the dimension style editor, notice that my text height is set to 2. And that means, in this case, since we're working on a metric drawing, that means 2 millimeters. So I no longer have to guess and go back and forth between the model space window and figure out how big my text should be and then print it out and guess again as to whether or not it's the right size. If I want it to be 2 millimeters high in real world units, I can just enter 2 here and it will actually print out on the page as 2 millimeters. Okay, so it's a lot easier to deal with. Similarly, back here in the lines category, if I want settings like, for example, extend beyond dim lines to be set to 2 and offset from origin to be set to 2, I can just use the number 2, okay, and that's going to give me 2 millimeters. It's real world units. So what I would do here is I would set up, we'll just go from left to right in lines. First thing I like to do is set these all up by layer, and then I'll just have an actual dimension layer in my layer manager. And I want to do that because everything about the dimension layer I typically want to have on a really light line weight. Dimensions shouldn't have a real commanding presence on your drawing. They should be kind of subtle and secondary to the built elements. So I'm going to set those up, all of this according to layer, and then I can just manage that a little bit easier when it comes time to print. So color for the lines by layer, line type by layer, all the way down. And the only numbers you need to worry about for the moment are extend beyond dim lines, set to 2, and offset from origin, set to 2. And I'll slide over to symbols and arrows. Architectural tick is what I'm going to use. Again, arrow size set to 2. I'm not going to tell you that every office and the thou shalts of the architecture world are architectural tick, because you will see offices that use other conventions. Just kind of get to know whatever office conventions you need to know, and I guess be adaptable. I'll leave the rest of those for now. Text, as I mentioned before, we want to choose under style. So text style, choose one that's annotative. Okay, if you haven't set one up yet, just use the default annotative